I'm going to be a little loosey-goosey with it, so you might not want it later. So,
You have to take some.
all right, Marion, do you want me to jump in? You want me to wait a little bit?
It's like 1 minute after. I'd give about 4 minutes. People can just, I see people are working on things, and why don't we give people a few more minutes to hop in? I know that there was a lecture on natural plants dying with the Central Virginia Fiber Guild, so maybe a few people are still there.
So what are people working on? Nancy, what are you working on?
I'm literally winding yarn. That's super exciting. I've got my friend Wendy with me too, but she's blurred out. So hello.
Oh, good. Hi.
But
And the other Nancy, what are you making?
I'm knitting what I'm hoping is going to be a yoga mat. I'm planning to full it after I finish knitting it. And I'm knitting it with yarn, some that I spun, but they're either natural. This is a natural colored yarn. This one I dyed with black walnut. This one was dyed with indigo. This one was dyed with a mushroom.
Oh, fun.
This one was dyed with jewelweed, the kind of pinky tan. And then the yellow one I'm working on right now is dyed with goldenrod.
Wow.
Wow.
Fun.
you put the jewelweed up? I haven't dyed with jewelweed before.
It's this one right here.
That's
It's kind of
pretty.
a pinky tan.
Cool.
Yeah.
It's not on my list of plants to think about dyeing with.
I used it at the end of the season after it had gone to seed, because the whole plant just dies back anyway. So I just cut it just before it was ready to get killed by frost, and then just chopped it up and put it in water and cooked it.
Cool.
It was pretty easy. I used alum for a mordant.
Okay.
Nice. And you're stitching something, Marion. What are you stitching?
I am stitching, hold on, I'm renaming myself. I made a felted pod, like a 3-dimensional pod, and I'm adding beads to it.
Oh, fun.
Ooh,
Yeah,
interesting.
just to play.
And
I was
Francis,
trying to
are you
use
working on
natural
something?
fibers, and they were ugly.
Francis, are you working on something?
Not in the moment, but I'll probably have it out later.
I'm still working on my socks 2 at a time.
Oh, very good.
Nice. Look at that.
Almost done. Like,
They'll eventually get done. I'm in the boring part to get to the toe. So
Mhm.
That's good. Okay. What else? What else is happening out here? So yeah,
well, I guess I could, for some of you who don't know, we are doing the Sustainable Cloth Challenge again this year. So Nancy, I don't know if you know about it, but what you're making sounds like it would probably be something that would work for the challenge.
I have signed up for it for this
Oh,
year.
good. Good.
I belong to the Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge, and my friend Kathy Reed did it last year.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Her project was so fun because she grew cotton in her backyard. Then she hand spun it, and then she made it into a sweet little facial washcloth.
Yeah,
You know,
it was
all
really
from
nice.
her cotton is like so fun.
Yeah.
and I
That's
love
fun.
the fact that she apparently ginned it with her pasta machine.
Oh, that's right. I keep forgetting about that.
I'm still fascinated by that.
Yeah.
Yeah. She showed some of the guild members how she did that. It was pretty amazing that worked so well.
So for that, our first meeting will be the 29th of January, another Sunday, but it'll be at 3 o'clock instead of 2 o'clock.
Right.
And anybody can join. So if you're interested, basically it's about making some kind of textile from local fibers, local dyes, and local labor. And there's also two other streams that you can work in. One is upcycling to keep textiles out of the landfill. And the other one is borrowing, knowing that we don't have all the infrastructure for what we need. So you may need to borrow you know, maybe you want to use cochineal and obviously that doesn't grow here, that kind of thing. So if you haven't signed up, you can go to the website, and right on the front page is a link to sign up for that if you're interested to do it.
And also know that if you don't have all the materials or skills, a lot of people get together as teams, or we can help you find someone who wants to work with you. So it's also a fun aspect of it, is to get to know someone else in the process.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about future events, our next meetup after this one is going to be on March 19th, where Kirsten and others will be talking about how to plant your natural dye garden for the year to come. So that should be a fun event as well. So we're now just past, it's 2:06. So Lauren, why don't we get started? And thank you, first of all, for coming to talk to us about regenerative agriculture and what we can do to be a part of this sort of trend.
Yeah, the trend that's in, right?
Yeah.
So I'll go ahead and apologize. I'm fighting bad internet and 2 teenage dogs that are never quiet. So if you hear it sounds like my house is coming down, it's just oversized puppies. So. All right. See if I can put it in fancy present mode. All right. So regenerative ag is this new exciting term that everybody is so excited about. And it really is just a return to very traditional farming techniques. But they have found that it implies all these new and exciting things to sequester carbon and stack functions for farmers. And we don't need fertilizer as much. So that's why it's had this new like regeneration, and you're hearing it in the news all the time. What people are struggling with is, what is regenerative agriculture? Well, we know a lot of different techniques that are inclusive, but they are struggling to really like define what is regenerative agriculture. Like, if you rotationally graze, are you a regenerative farmer? Well, sort of, but also kind of there's more to it. So anyway, we're really struggling with, what does this even mean? So generally the 5 or 7 principles, depending on which nonprofit you ask, is to increase biodiversity. And that's at soil level, animal level, tree, plant, fungi, everything. The big focus that I think everybody is really agreeing on is it's a focus on soil health, restoring topsoil, restoring natural ecosystems in the soil. And that's kind of the big unifier. It's regenerative if it has a focus on soil health. So while that's a principle, I would argue that it's kind of the base point to all of this. It improves the watershed with water retention. So you guys know that improved soils reduce runoff and help, that you have to water less if it's in a garden variety, or it helps keeps pastures more moist. Enhancing ecosystems, capturing carbon, and increasing yields and nutritional benefits. They're finding that obviously the better the soil quality, the better nutrition that comes out as a grazing product, or even if it's an apple or kind of an agroforestry, that the fruits and nuts that are produced are significantly more nutrient dense than the ones that come from conventional systems. They are working on quantifying that now, but they're about to say that it's essentially 8-to-1, that you would have to produce 8 conventional apples to have the nutrient equivalent of 1 regenerative apple. So the implications of the nutrient gains for farmers is pretty amazing if we really focus on this. And all of our forefathers knew this, but we're playing catch up and pretending like we know this again. And the big thing that why everybody is so excited about this movement is they found it absorbs carbon. That, guess where the carbon is stored? It's in the soil. So, with all the different climate change, we're saying, well, if we move our agriculture industry towards regenerative practices, if less than half of the American farmland is brought into regenerative practices, we can reduce the carbon levels to pre-industrial revolution levels. So we can improve a lot. Like, we can do a lot with this. And a lot of you guys already know this. So I'm pretty excited about it. I feel like it's got places to go. Anyway, so it's basically nature and farming and returning to old systems. What does it provide? Reduced flooding and drought. You guys have all seen the pig farms where the manure is all sloughed up and then it's creating algae and huge disturbances. With regenerative, that doesn't happen. Replenishing water sources. Because it's back to a natural infiltration system, we're going to be able to even start refilling aquifers, as we are not removing water from systems, but we're allowing it to continue through the cycles. Fire hazards. This is kind of a little side one, but I'll take you down it real quick, that if we use goats and other animals to remove underbrush, places like California are going to be less prone to fire because there's less dead waste because the animals are consuming it. So there are a lot of places out in California that are using mass sheep and goat grazing to reduce fire hazards and prevent California wildfires. So that's pretty neat. And as I said, we can use it to reverse global warming, capture carbon from the atmosphere and put it back in the soils. Nutrient dense food, I think, is why I'm most excited about it. You know, like I said, the apples to apples, that we can create better food, which would really do a lot for food insecure families, that we don't have to bring as much food into a system if the food quality is better. So there's a lot of scaling that we can do without necessarily increasing outputs, but just making a better product. Lots of regenerative systems can operate without pesticides and fertilizers because the soil content is improved. So a lot of farmers are very interested in this for cutting down on fertilizer costs, which we all know have been super high. So it's kind of this natural trend that you can reduce fertilizers and eventually get rid of them altogether. A question that usually comes up is regenerative organics. Everybody is still fighting about that question, so I can answer more questions about that later, but as of right now, it is not specific that it has to be organic to be regenerative. Back to kind of the runoff, we're reducing dead zones and water pollution by better managing waste products as manure. When it's, you know, not 10,000 pounds of it, it tends to integrate into a system a little bit more naturally. And then, of course, biodiversity. If we, you know, think about pastures, we're returning native environments to birds and bugs and all these different things that we've been removing their habitat by grazing to levels where they can't exist. So it allows biodiversity to integrate into animal systems. And of course, the last one is reconnecting humans with nature. Like, we love that all the time. When I see agriculture and it's a giant combine spraying things, of course, that's not really farming to me. So I think just returning to kind of a permaculture mindset, that we're looking at the system and learning from what we see in front of us. What are the weeds telling us about our soil? You know, what are our animals telling us about our fields? So I really enjoy that we can kind of learn from nature how it wants to be done a little bit better. Right now, the stats say that 75% of land on the earth is degraded, and that includes deserts that used to be, you know, oases and all this other place. And they always think that once they're gone forever, but we're finding that that's not necessarily true. There's been some pioneers that have literally taken deserts and returned them to grasslands. So don't be sad because they're all destroyed. They can come back. A lot of people ask regenerative versus sustainable. Sustainable agriculture arguably says to maintain the status quo. Regenerative is to improve upon what is currently existing. So 75% of the world is degraded. I don't really want to sustain that. I would prefer it be much better than that. So that's why I really like the word regenerative instead of the word sustainable. And that's why you'll see me argue we should be regenerative instead of sustainable. Kind of for the people who do more gardening and crop focused, the big thing is no-till versus till. When you till up the soil, it makes bioavailability and you have all this access to things, but it's also destroying soil structure and fungal structures. So they're finding that no-till systems of incorporating are able to sequester more CO2 than the tilled systems. So this is specifically on carbon emissions. No-till systems are able to sequester significantly larger amounts of carbon into the soil, which helps soil structure, which helps fungi networks, and so on. On average, we're losing about 4 tons of topsoil per year. Obviously, like along the Mississippi and all the places where corn and soy is grown, it is at disastrous levels. Like essentially our farmland is washing down the Mississippi, and it's creating all these imbalances because it's being washed out of where it's supposed to be. So this is kind of a huge issue that our topsoil is leaving us, and there are so many things we can be doing to prevent that. Here's kind of some of the basic other integrations is no-till. Don't leave the ground bare. Cover crops, different things. Obviously, if soil is exposed, it's going to be exposed to runoff. It's going to be exposed to wind. It's going to be exposed to all different elements. So the more we can keep layers on top of the soil, which can be, you know, grasses that have fallen over, or cover crops, different things, that's better. No chemicals, compost amendments. Don't overgraze. There's all different arguments on exactly what overgrazing is, but I'm just going to leave it at that because we don't want to get in arguments about exact grazing levels. And some of the other things are focused on perennial systems rather than annuals, as the roots in the system help keep that soil structure together. Other things that you'll start seeing that kind of go into agroforestry are silvopasture integrations or riparian zones. Essentially, that means integrating trees in a way that makes sense with your animals and different things like that. And there's many different expressions of it, so I'll leave that there though for now. All right, I care about producer benefits. So why I thought it was really important to bring this to Fibershed is you guys have this very amazing market of people who are interested in fiber for, wanting to be local. But there's this new integration of people who say, I want to buy something that's sustainable or something that's regenerative. A lot of people in the Fibershed and other markets are already making them. They just don't know to label them as such. So I think if producers can be really aware that there's a new consumer demand for these products, I think you can sell them at significantly higher rates. We've seen this with New York Textile Lab, that she is making quote unquote regenerative products, and they're selling for, hundreds and hundreds of dollars because people understand that it's not just fiber, it's an ecological impact. And it's really helping connect that conversation for consumers that what they buy has a direct impact on agriculture. So I think that's something that farmers like us, we can really improve that conversation. We can explain that, fiber created in stronger systems is a stronger fiber. It's less brittle. It has all these other different benefits, along with the fact that it's got biodiversity, sequestering carbon, like doing all these other really amazing things. So what I struggle with, it's a little overwhelming to talk about all the different things. So I usually encourage people to find like one thing and lead with it. One of it is that rotational grazing improves soil. So, and I explain it that the sheep comes along, eats the top of the grass, and moves on in a rotational system, and that gives that grass time to rejuvenate and come back. And they kind of get it. They say, okay, I kind of understand that, grass needs rest to regrow. Like that's pretty basic. And I think kind of helping people just connect to things that are kind of farmer ideas, but letting them place value and understanding that takes a lot of work to move animals around. It's so much easier to throw them out in a pasture and never see them again. But letting them value why farmers are doing this extra work, I think, is really important. So what's tough about this market is it's all non-defined right now. Again, what is regenerative? How would you as a producer quantify yourself as regenerative? Do you want to go out and see what certifications are out there? They're all very expensive. I don't necessarily advocate that everybody go get quote unquote regenerative certified. But the problem is this burden falls back on the farmer to then continue to explain their product. So first you have to create amazing product, and then you have to communicate value to the customer. And it kind of stacks these problems. But the movement is catching up, and people are starting to intrinsically understand that regenerative is a good system. So that's kind of where I want to open up the conversation to you guys. Like, is this falling in your wheelhouse? What questions do you have about how this is going to be applied? Because we have people approaching, my company is Regenerative Farmers of America. Basically, I wanted to create a hub where people who are farming this way can get eyes on their products. And people are coming to us saying, I want to source regenerative. I want to buy meat that's regenerative. I want to buy wool that's regenerative. And then the problem is that the supply chains aren't necessarily there. So somebody comes to me and they're like, I want to buy 100,000 pounds of regenerative wool. Well, I know all the farms, but they're also spread out all over the country. They're not near the same mills. They might have scouring issues, so the supply chain is struggling with the lack of certification and then the spread out of where these farmers are. So those are kind of the big, large scale problems. And I will open it up to questions, input, thoughts, opinions.
Thank you, Lauren. I have a question. As not a producer, what should I be asking for if I want a product that's regenerative, even though there's not a standard? What question should I be asking that producer?
That is the hardest thing. So one of the first things that I feel that rotational grazing is a kind of staple. Rotational grazing is one of the biggest things that you can do to be a regenerative producer. So when you are looking at farmers, you want to see mobile fencing. You want to see either netting or you want to see grazing patterns where the animals are moving. And that's something you just either have to ask them, do you rotate your animals? If so, how often are you rotating? If they say, well, I move them between 2 pastures, not necessarily regenerative. You'll find people in the regenerative network that they're moving their animals 5 times a day. That's a little much, right? Like those people are very, very into what they do, but that's kind of the scale, is that you're starting to understand that movement is part of regeneration, animals being moved like buffalo, trees being incorporated. And if you start looking at their systems and asking them, and they start telling you about the natural cycle, those are kind of key indicators that they're listening to nature and they're starting to see, rather than saying, well, I put this much fertilizer down this week and this is how much I'm producing. It's almost a whole different mindset. So that would be, and this is why it's a little tough, is educating the consumer on how to buy ethically. And that's why certifications would really help, but also are a burden.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I think that, so I don't have sheep. I grow, plants and teach people how to use a lot of cover crops, and even in your garden, how to manage those cover crops with hand tools. But you could ask people, or ask the sheep producers, well, how do they keep their pastures fertilized? And also, you can say that you've heard that sheep have worms. So what do you do about the worm problem? Do you have a worm problem? And just because I've told people, if they want to know if somebody's an organic gardener at the farmer's market, ask them how they keep the bean beetles off the beans or the potato bugs. And if they start talking about compost and ecosystem, you want to buy that stuff. But if they say they found, because it's happened to me once, I asked this one guy and he told me about this product that he had. It was just so good. It knocks him dead, and it's made by the Bear Company. Oh my gosh.
And that is what you run from. Yeah.
Bringing up the question about the deworming the sheep, are there regenerative practices for preventing worms? Because I know, it goes into the sheep system, then it goes out into the in the manure, and it can be damaging to not only the worms inside them, but other wildlife in the ecological system. So
yep, you are totally right. And this is a problem that regenerative farmers definitely face. So of course, you guys know that rotationally grazing, when you guys deworm, it's expelled, and then you of course want to move the animals off that pasture so they're not re-ingesting it. So we kind of already know that rotational grazing does provide some benefits to the worming process. But to your point of when they come out, usually what will be done is to focus on amending a spot where they did come out. So if I have a section and I know this is where I did deworm them, I know that my soil is compromised by that dewormer. So I might go in and make sure I'm putting earthworms down, or I'm doing something like maybe putting a cover crop to kind of absorb those things. But I just want to think that I know the soil has kind of taken a beating. What can I do to alleviate it and pull it up? Like, not a good example, but hemp pulls lots of impurities out of the soil. Okay. So hemp will pull it out, and then we would harvest it and remove it from that area because it's absorbed it. Well, there's tons of cover crops that do that too. So it's kind of thinking with nature. I did something bad. What can I do to kind of help it? And then, of course, we try to just maintain better. Well, we all don't want worms in our sheep anyway, so we're all focused on that at the starting point. But of course, it's kind of an essential. We have to do it at some point.
So do Christmas trees we keep our daughter's buck goats. We throw the Christmas tree in the pasture with them, and they eat it up. So does that help with worming with sheep also?
Yeah, so I am a huge proponent of all natural deworming, and I have definitely failed in the execution. So it's a level that, like, if you can get good at natural deworming, like, that's amazing. Kudos to you. I have had to fall back on some pharmaceutical deworming. So I think there's a balance, but definitely, like, if you have fir trees and, all the trees that have the anti-parasite benefits, if you know that they're having issues, you just move them into grazing those trees for a little while. Not even like the Christmas tree is a great example because you just chuck it out in your backyard and it has a use. But as opposed to, we've talked about like, well, there's certain areas of our farm that grow more of those trees. Well, we tend to move the sheep before winter to that area so that they get a little bit of a natural dewormer. And then we check levels afterwards to see if we do need parasite treatment. So it's kind of thinking like, what is available to you and what is the timing of that being applied? If that helps clarify a little. There's so many expressions that it would be tough to explain them all, but generally that.
I like that idea that you're checking rather than just automatically dosing them. That's an interesting way to work it too.
Yeah, we're near Virginia Tech, so they always are advocates of, here's a $5 test, go check the fecal matter, and it saved us a lot of money on constant dewormer, and of course the issue of building up tolerance to it. But we've just found 1 year it's something totally different, 1 year it's a new different thing because of our fields are improving over time. So our farm is kind of constantly changing. What parasite it is 1 week is a whole different thing the next year. I don't need to just be annihilating, like, so I had 3 different, parasite things and I'm shooting them up. They're taking 10 things, they're spitting it all over. If I just only have to give them 1 because there's only 1 parasite issue I'm dealing with, that also is telling me about my soil. It's telling me about my forages. What parasite is thriving in my environment and what am I doing that's creating that environment for it? So there's an area of my farm that tends to get more runoff and get swampy in the spring. Well, clearly, if that's where there was a parasite issue before, I'm not bringing them back there next spring if I already know that. So just kind of the more we can think about our specific scenario and not replicating something that didn't go well, what's it telling us to change?
Hi, Lauren and Fibershed. This is my first time joining this group, but I'm really just heartened to be a part of this. I've been studying permaculture for several years, and I'm actually currently enrolled in a regenerative agriculture bachelor's program.
There you go.
One of the difficulties that I've been experiencing, so I've really been trying to proliferate industrial hemp as a fiber, which is what drew me to this group in the first place. One of the difficulties I've been finding, I'm not a landowner, and I've had to start a farm now 3 times just because when you come at it from a regenerative perspective, I feel like a lot of people aren't prepared for that kind of time investment. And so like each time, I've done something where I'm building a soil level or I'm doing some sheet mulching or something like that, people are just so used to this instant results form of farming. And so I guess I would wonder if you have any insight for somebody who doesn't own land, but is trying to do regenerative agriculture still.
Well, that's a great question. And so on my platform, Regenerative Farmers America, we talk about this a lot. And we talk about one of the things we're trying to do is figure out a way in land leases that people can communicate that with their landlords. Because I think there's a disconnect between farm landlords who just want to make money and see the ROI, as opposed to some who are kind of more expressive and say, okay, I'd be open to a 10-year contract because I know this is a process. So just on the surface for you, I would start looking into people who kind of have higher values on that they're going to want to take longer leases. I would probably run away from shorter contracts because there's a lot of people who are now coming to me and say, I only want to lease my land to people who are going to farm it well. I actually don't care what they're going to pay me. So as this movement grows, people value it and value it more. And I think you're going to see it change. And it's just connecting with the right person about that.
So Lauren, are there some specific regenerative practices that people could do in their backyard if they have a little garden in their backyard, or even if they are planting in barrels or something like that? Is there stuff that they can do to help the environment as well?
Yep. So definitely no-till systems are my backyard recommendations. Everybody says, I'm going to start a garden. They grab the rototiller and they go to town. So that's not something I advocate for. I really like, there is a guy, his name is Charles Downing. He has a YouTube channel and it will tell you every single question you've ever had about gardening in a no-till method. And I can send you guys his info, but he's huge on YouTube. He has thousands of followers. Delightful, tiny little British man who just takes every question out of it. But even our backyard, the building of the soil is, we haven't figured out what's the level that it stops sequestering carbon. So even on your little plot, you continue to not till, you continue to bring carbon back down and you're improving it. So it's basically using compost amendments and using, cardboard as weed barriers, and you're just continuing to build up. rather than to have to dig down and destroy soil structure. You're just building on top of it. And there was this amazing farmer I just watched. He grows the largest corn crop in Virginia in the Chesapeake, and he has been practicing no-till for 35 years. So it can be done, and it takes a little bit to get in a finesse with it, because the first couple of years are the hardest because the soil isn't quite ready, and it takes a little bit to build up. So it's not an immediate return, but if you can stick with it, it creates the most amazing soil you've ever seen, and it definitely can produce really high yields. So that's my number one, is try to move to no-till.
So I wrote the book, Grow a Sustainable Diet, which talks about all of that. If you're growing your food, how to grow, how to choose the cover crops, do the rotations, cut the right cover crop at the right time, leave it lie there as you mulch and plant into it. And I taught that at Reynolds Community College in Goochland County in Virginia. And I've also got a DVD and a couple DVDs out. But I also have a blog that has so much information about that. And my website is homeplaceearth.com. Use all the E's in Home Place Earth. And from there's a link to my blog. You'll see that. So my book coming out in July is, and there's a picture of it on my blog. I'm not taking orders yet. But anyway, I discuss about what cover crops you would plant before and after flax and cotton, so that you're going to keep the soil up.
I think I'm going to need to interview Cindy on my on my different blogs and all these things, because yeah, cover crop is my next one that I just it can either, Cindy, you can definitely talk farther, but it has the ability to pull bad things out, and it also has the ability to put good things in. And there's so many different expressions of that just based on what you're doing. It's a little overwhelming, but it's amazing.
Yeah, my work was based on John Jevons' biointensive stuff, that you grow all of your compost materials in your garden. And so normally you would put, when I learned to garden in the 70s and 80s, and then you'd always see garden maps and the compost piles around the outside of the garden, which made sense because you're bringing all this stuff to make your compost, and then you're going to put it down. But with Jevons, you produce all as part of your rotation, you're producing the cover crops that become your compost. And then you're not bringing everything outside in. And the year that butternut squash grew wild over my compost pile that was on the outside edge of the garden. And then, the light bulb pops up. I think all this nutrients, all this goodness is leaching into the soil when I keep my compost in the same spot every year. So then and since I was now growing all of my compost materials, I started rotating the compost in the garden. So for 1 year, one bed for the whole year has compost piles on it. And in the fall, I spread out that, move what's not ready to the next bed. And I plant rye where the compost was. And that ends up getting cut down as mulch. And I have my best corn crop in that bed after. But it's just, once you think of how everything intertwines and works together, it's fascinating.
Marion, I can't hear you. You're on mute.
I'm trying to be careful here. Lauren, what kind of, you talk about certifications for farmers and for wool. Yeah. And I know that out in the Fibershed in California, they have climate beneficial wool, and there are other designations. What should we in a Fibershed, what could we be doing to sort of work towards our own certification?
Well, so the certification is everybody who's in this space wants to make their own unique certification, and they know what levels they want to measure. Well, a crop farmer is completely different from a livestock farmer, is completely different from fiber. And that's where all these different voices are coming in about what is regenerative, but it's a mess. So quite honestly, at this point, I am arguing for consumers to learn and us to communicate, because I don't think there is a certification that serves the small farmer well. Mm-hmm. So I think consumers understand, and they know there needs to be a certification, but they also know that they can get that information directly from their farmer. So until there is a good certification, they're not really advantageous to the small farmer. There's a lot called Regenerative Organic Alliance, Savory Institute has a land to market. There's a lot of them, but you really have to be like 100,000 acre farm. Like you have to be really big to warrant the amount of money and different things that come in to certify and prove all these things. Shanika Wool in California, they do the Fibershed. She submitted to a third-party testing. She had people come in for 3 years and all this money that she spent on proving that her farm was carbon negative. And it's a certification and a label that not everybody values. So it was great that she proved it, but if the right person doesn't value that test or that person doesn't value that certification. So I think until we agree on a certification, and is it regenerative, is it climate smart, is it organic, is it, whatever, is it biodiverse, is it permaculture? There's all these other different expressions. I just advocate for direct to consumer communication until something emerges that serves people well.
Okay, so you also mentioned that you watch, there's several YouTubes that you've seen or other sources for people. Do you have sources that you would recommend that folks take a look at?
So if you're a social media person, definitely Regenerative Farmers America. Basically what I'm doing is I am so enamored with what everybody is doing. I just want to highlight them. So it's anything from fiber farmers to agroforestry integrations, but it's the expressions of all these different people. And then through our YouTube, we're trying to do deeper interviews for people to share, which Cindy, I'm going to have to ask you on to talk about cover cropping. There's too many expressions. It's overwhelming, but it just inspires me to see different things. Somebody planted a hazelnut crop into their pastures, and it was really great for the livestock because they could eat the hazelnut leaves as well as there was a hazelnut product. And it's just stuff like that. Like, well, if I'm going to plant trees, why don't I plant trees that grow food? And there's just all these kind of obvious things that come from watching. So I would say that one. And then you can kind of taper off and see the other people. If you see something repeatedly doing something awesome with sheep, you should go follow them. But it's this hub because there's too many good things going on.
Great. It's good to hear though. Good to hear.
Yeah. Well, and it's hard to talk about it because it's like, well, let's talk about trees. Let's talk about composting. Let's talk about cover crops. Let's talk about, and it gets a little.
Great. Thank you.
Lauren, do you think that there's a value to having, for small farmers to do a carbon farming plan? And how do you go about doing that? If you think there's value.
I think it's good to have a general framework for yourself of a carbon plan, but I also kind of think of it, to Benjamin's point, more as a permaculture plan. You're winning if you're farming with nature. Carbon is going in the soil because that's where it belongs. So it's not to focus on carbon, it's to focus on what stacking functions restore natural systems to your farm. And that's kind of what I advocate for. And then just kind of move towards that and know that you're definitely going to make adjustments. Like, the deer came in and they ate all 100 of the trees that I planted for my windbreak. All right, we're probably going to try a more deer-proof tree system and better shields. So just, I say create the permaculture, the holistic plan, and then kind of adjust as you go from there.
Awesome.
If I could share a point on that one, Lauren.
Yeah, please.
Especially because I've been focusing a lot more on hemp, there's a lot of question about carbon credits and how you can set up a farm to sell carbon credits. I think that industry is still so new that we won't really be able to see a clear and easy way to say, I grew these trees, where do I get a carbon credit or a carbon tax, or how do I sell this to people? But I do think in the coming years, it'll be a lot easier for people to say, I grew so much of this crop. We have a calculation for how much this is worth in terms of carbon.
I definitely agree. Carbon credit markets are something I focused on a lot because it's an additional revenue source for farmers who are doing this. So I'm like, if you're going through all this work of rotational grazing and planting trees, I think you should be paid for it. So it's a struggle because there's a carbon credit program that's focused on soil that they're doing for mass soybean, mass corn, that they're saying, if you stop tilling, we'll give you carbon credits. They can't figure out how to measure the soil and to really say, yes, you've definitely captured carbon or not at a really tangible layer. I will say Virginia is starting to move into agroforestry carbon credit programs. There is a nonprofit called Working Trees. And I'm happy to send out this information. If you're on the Regenerative Farmers newsletter, I send out this kind of stuff. Working Trees came in and they said, we would love for you to grow 200 trees on your farm, and we will pay you carbon credits because we are negotiating with the carbon credit market to get those to farmers. So there's starting to be nonprofit entities that are stepping in the middle that they are to advocate for the farmer receiving those credits. So the programs are out there, they're in pilots, and they're definitely flawed and they're definitely being figured out. for example, I am doing one of the Working Trees programs. We're implementing 300 trees on 60 acres this spring. And I asked them, I said, well, what happens if there is a blight or the deer eat them all and I am just wiped out halfway through the contract? Do I have to repay? Do I have to do? And they say, we don't know. We're figuring this out. Like, you know, so carbon credit programs are really developing. They do want to get them into real farmers' hands, but they're very volatile. So that is something in my network I'm trying to at least tell you, like, this is a program I heard of, and this is when they're open, and this is when they close. But they're coming and they're here. They just have some issues.
I have a question. Is there any emphasis in the regenerative movement towards native plants and using native plants?
Yes, there is huge like return to native plants and perennials. So the perennials, the root systems stay in the ground forever and it improves the soil health. And so they're arguing if you put it in, it should be native because it is more indicative of what is natural to survive there. So it's another layer of those things that if you plant, it should be native. So that's a big part. But you know, farmers, we want to put in like exactly what's going to feed cattle at the highest protein rate and all that good stuff. So there's a little bit of a fight, but we're trying to figure out in those native grasses, what is something that can sustain the new breeds of livestock. And then there'll be a question of livestock breeds. Well, Holstein cattle probably didn't thrive on native grasses particularly well because a Holstein cow from 40 years ago to a Holstein cow now has an entirely different diet. You know, they're so hard to fatten on grass and all these things, and that's why we grain feed. So it's also about choosing a system that's going to support your animals. That's a whole different debate that I can definitely go down that road. But essentially, when I chose animals that were prone to doing well on grass because I didn't have good grass forages. And if I was putting in that system that they were supposed to live on it, I was going to pick something that was more adapt to survive on that.
Thank you.
Just on that topic of like planting native, it does seem like there's so much also like in this discussion of climate change and how, you know, climates have changed and plants have shifted and moved up. And so what we call native, you know, sort of right now is shifting in a way, you know, because we have a climate. And so we have plants that are maybe appropriate to think about planting. It's complicated and the discourse is very complicated too.
It is, but I think that's why farmers have this just ability to try things and make mistakes. Like that was the whole thing is I wanted to highlight farmers that are making mistakes and learning things. There is a farmer in Georgia and he grazes cattle on invasive kudzu. And like, who would have thought of that? But kudzu is destroying everything. Well, it's a high forage for cattle. And they were like, oh, it'll kill them. Well, it didn't. And it's producing these amazing cattle and really helping fight kudzu so that the other stuff can come back. So it's all like your context, like, you know, yeah. Yeah. We had invasive blackberry. I had bought a bunch of goats because I don't want to be torn apart by blackberries every time I leave my house, you know? So.
I had a question, and it was very early on where you were sort of talking about regenerative versus sustainable. And I guess I had just never, you know, when I think of sustainable practices or sustainable farming, I hadn't thought of it as sustaining what we have now. I don't know. I know like all of these, we're shifting and using different labels, climate beneficial, you know, this, that, or is it organic? And, you know, I do think ultimately I liked what, you know, that sort of the discussion with the farmer and the relationship that the farmer has to the land as caretaker and giving back to a land that gives to us and all of that. Seems like the measure really of who you want to, you know.
Well, and I think that's why this is so important to me. It's not a new thing that has to be figured out. We're returning to things that were very important to forefathers and people before us because they didn't have access to fertilizer and quick fixes. So it's hard for young people, especially to say, well, it's going to take some time and this might be a 2-year transition, but the ability for people to have to look at land and ask it what's going on, I think is a whole cultural thing that might be more needed, even more than sequestering carbon, even more than growing the right plants. Like it's a whole mind shift. So I think that's why the space is just so important to me. And we can definitely say like consumers are coming, there's a new market, there's a new buying wave for farmers. Great. Like, well, let's make farmers make money, but this movement is just so much more impactful and it has so much deeper roots than all that.
Are there other questions or comments?
Oh, I have one. I was thinking about the Amish farmers who never went to the, chemical fertilizers and that sort of thing. Do you consult with them or consider their methods?
So where I struggle with the Amish farmers a little bit is they still heavily rely on no-till methods, as that, is very indicative of the plowing up of the system. But generally, you'll see the rest of the stuff they do is integrated. So the agroforestry, the cover crops, the rotational grazing they do perform a lot. I haven't figured out why tilling seems to be the break in those conversations. I find Amish are not very receptive to wanting to talk about movements and things. So I would say there is a split. It's not that, anybody I know is consulting with them, but that's kind of the only big difference I see. Because you're right. Like, how do people do this who didn't have inputs? And tilling is the only one I haven't quite figured out.
Because I was going to say that they've been doing it, and obviously it's sustainable. Those farms have been in families for generations, so it's clearly working. Although, as you said, they do seem to enjoy their tilling practice.
I believe it's a manure integration is what I think it is. And I wouldn't quote me on this. I'm not an expert, but because they are using cattle, the cattle, of course, are dropping feces and excrement in it as they are doing it. And I do have a video of a guy who does use cattle to, he still does tilling on his market garden. And he's regenerative, but that's like his hang on. And I do think it's an integration. So it's not saying you never till. It's saying, well, you could till if you're also doing amendments and creating systems that go in. I will always advocate for no-till in its purest form, but there are definitely other systems.
So I grew up in Ohio, in Northeast Ohio, and there's a large Amish contingent there. And I've found that a lot of people credit Amish with things that have this idea of the Amish, which are not necessarily how the Amish are. Like, I was in a talk one time and somebody talked about Amish. I said, so do you think that the Amish bake their own bread? And she said, yes. I said, no, I've been in the grocery store with them and their carts are loaded with sugar cereal and white bread, just like everybody else. So I have a feeling their gardening practices are not necessarily organic. It's, I don't know what their gardening practices are. I know that if I drive in that area, there are fewer home gardens than there used to be. And I don't think they necessarily are embracing all the ideals that people think they are. Could be wrong. But
I'm sure there's both spectrums,
in
right?
the grocery store and knowing a few of them.
I think it's like everything. It's a continuum, right? There's going to be some that do totally different things on the end of the scale. And it's just which version are we interacting with?
Sometimes I think people get set in their way. So I have a small vegetable garden and I've been working on no-till for a while. And I talked to my dad and my brother about it. My brother says, I have a tiller. I'm going to use my tiller. And I'm like,
yeah.
Okay.
It's definitely a mindset
Watching
issue.
the Fibershed Zoom meeting.
Yeah. But I think you'll find that the people who are using conventional techniques, while they might not actively be asking you about it, they're watching you. Another quick example is there's this amazing couple out in Oklahoma. They are 7th generation from conventional. The daughter is the 7th generation, and they do all corn and soybean and feedlot cattle. And she came in, she went off, she said, I'm going to do regenerative. And they said, okay, here's 90 acres. Good luck. You're going to fail within 5 years. They have been more profitable than that family farm on their plot that they came in. They produce 5 species instead of 1, and they are producing more yields per acre. And we are about to, with investors, we're about to buy him a $10 million farm that's 7,000 acres for him to transition. And with that, he will become increasingly more profitable than his family farm. And they are now coming to him and saying, how can we transition the rest of the 7th generation family farms to become regenerative? So it took 5 years of them saying, hey, we're going to sit back while you fail. But they're watching, and it's people showing that it can be done and being the leaders. So I think it's amazing when you say, no rototiller, you take that thing away.
Lauren, are you seeing a lot of shift in terms of like the bigger farms, I guess I would use the term like over 100 acres, that there is kind of an interest on the larger size farms, or is there still mostly just like a smaller farm interest in regenerative agriculture?
No, this is definitely getting big. Pepsi, Cargill, massive foundations and massive producers are starting to start the conversation of how do we do this? They're not meeting their marks because it's harder than they anticipated because of scale, but there are massive industries moving to this with all the money that's flowing in from Congress and all these different places. There is a massive shift. Also, already like ranching out west was pretty regenerative anyway, because you can't have hundreds and hundreds of head on cattle on the same spot. So it's actually bringing this return to regenerative ranching, that it's not demonized, it's actually celebrated. So those farms that are truly grass-fed are being able to make better margins than CFOs and feedlots and things like this. So we as a consumer, when we value grass-fed, it trickles back up to these massive systems. We have a farm that's over 100,000 acres in the West that's all just regenerative grazing with cattle. And it's, thousands and thousands of acres through mountain ranges. But it's a huge return. I would actually argue it's more big than small, because people want to see impact. They want to see large amounts of carbon sequestered. So big projects are happening everywhere, like everywhere.
But if you want to plug in with some of the farmers in Virginia who are working on that, you can join Virginia Association for Biological Farming.
They are amazing.
Just at a conference last weekend, but they've got a lot of field days and things like that going on. And also Future Harvest, CASA based in Maryland, they've got, and they're Northern Virginia and Maryland. They have a lot of field days and things. They just had a conference, but yeah, you can get a lot of information and meet a lot of people that way.
Yeah. Cindy, I don't know if you've seen the map. Basically, I have a map up that anyone who's a regenerative farmer can self-list on it. So that also, Benjamin, if you want to just look, you can look at all the farmers in Virginia that have been on as regenerative farmers. And a lot of them have listings like we do tours on the estates. We do educational classes. So we're trying to increase that like transparency. If you want to learn this, where do you learn? So. And Cindy, if you have anybody who wants to be listed, I know I don't have everybody in Virginia.
And did you show it on this today?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay.
I tried to talk more about what it is rather than
I was going to say,
I have a website where people, so.
I'll check out your website.
Awesome.
I put your website and the working trees and the Charles Dowdy, I put all of that in the chat. So if people are interested, they can just click on those links. And we can put that also in the recording, in the notes up on the recording.
Yeah, basically all I'm trying to do is increase the transparency, that if people are interested in this, they know where to go, and then it kind of sorts them out to different places.
Wow.
I'm putting my website on here.
Well, this is great, you guys. Any more questions? Yes, Sarah.
Yeah, I have an orchard that I do no spray, and I'm wondering about, are there resources and organizations that are focused on orchards?
Definitely. So California is going to be more where you're going to see it out of, but they're starting to do rotational grazing and an incorporation with an orchard. So there's a lot of people that are going to help you with like what time of the year where it is not detrimental to the trees, but it's providing the manure. And I was about to say, Marion, if we can link some emails, I can send you some people that I think are really special to follow, because they're finding that they can reduce the amount they have to water because the soil has improved and has better retention rates and things like that. So maybe pairing with somebody in the Fibershed who has sheep, and you could rotate them through at a season. Like even that, doing it a couple times makes a massive difference on soil.
Great.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, on sheep and in orchards or goats, you have to be really careful, get them through there fast, because they really like to eat the bark. Believe me, I'm talking from experience.
Yeah. And in California, they're getting really good about like timing it and knowing what to look for in the trees before they integrate. So there's people doing some really amazing research, particularly the almond industry. Like, I don't know if anybody knows, the almond industry is like the spray industry. Like it's sprayed with glyphosate like 8 times in one season or something like that. Terrible. So they are very interested in reducing fertilizer, and they're doing a lot of pilots, which are pretty amazing.
That's cool. We in our Fibershed, Devil Bliss Wineries was using that system as well. I think that they have not making wine anymore, but they were running their sheep through to take care of all the weeds and everything like that. And they're part of our Fibershed.
Yeah, I was about to say I have tons of winery examples. Apparently something about that vine is a little bit easier to deal with than an orchard, but so there's tons of examples in that category. Any other questions, thoughts, opinions?
I have a question just out of curiosity. Can you do regenerative agriculture without animals?
Yes.
You can.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounding like you can't, but you can.
No, you can. I am a livestock person. I came because of animals, so everything I say comes out livestock. No, but you can definitely do no-till with cover crops and different amendments. And I find that market gardeners can create really amazing relationships with like a cattle farmer or somebody who isn't regenerative, that they can take manure and just do spreadings of it instead of having to manage a flock. So if you don't want livestock, there's definitely ways to do it without them. They have the gold at the end that makes everything work. Marion, I think you're on mute.
I keep doing that to make sure I don't make noise. So anyway, Lauren, we're coming up on the hour. So I want to thank everyone for stopping in today and hearing what Lauren has to say. I hope you'll look into regenerative agriculture even more after this chat. You know how to find us and to find Lauren. We'll look forward to seeing you again. And remember, our next community meetup is on March 19th, when we'll be talking about planting your dye gardens, getting ready for the spring. Lisa, anything else?
And maybe we somehow we can fold into that, you know, planting our dye gardens in a no-till way.
Yes, and I get to learn from you guys, so I'm excited. I'll use the no-till practices and see if I can butcher it.
Excellent.
Awesome. And as usual, this recording will be on our YouTube channel with the links that we have here so that people can see it far and wide.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.